I'm Oliver. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency. And for purposes of audio description, I'm a white male with blonde hair in a remarkably clean background room. So you're not missing anything if you're not watching my video. So I'm going to pass over to my other colleagues, Elise and then Isaac, who are joining us.
Hi everyone, my name is Elise. I'm the researcher on the evidence team, and for the audio description, I'm a white woman with short black hair, and also standing in the very white room.
And I'm Isaac, so I'm a research assistant in the team. I'm a white man in my mid-20s with blonde-eyed hair, and I'm also in quite a white room, but with a potted plant somewhere in the background. It is.
There's at least some life in nature lurking. Cheers, everyone. Hopefully, when we have a bit of a conversation later on, we'll get to hear about some of these different venues and organisations you already mentioned in the chat, which kind of sort of quite intriguing. So my cursor has disappeared, but it is back. So what we're talking about today is a bit of a run through of evidence and information that we've got at the Audience Agency that relates to South East London, and we'll say a bit about exactly what we mean by South East London in a sec. But also it's a chance to share that with you and get your thoughts and reflections on that, so we have a bit of a conversation later on about the implications of what we're sharing and what it might mean. So hopefully, yes, it will be kind of interactive, and do please feel free to ask questions or sort of pop things in the chat if you have any queries on the way through as well. We'll be sharing the presenter between us, but we're also trying to keep an eye on the chat when we're not speaking. So what we're going to be talking about overall is looking really at different scales of data and information we've got. Some things which are drawing on the national picture, but also looking at how that might apply to the local area in terms of who's in our local area, but also some more granular information from Audience Finder, which is our big data aggregation service that I'm sure many of you use, which is looking at mainly ticketing data, but a bit of survey data in there as well, looking at who's engaging and maybe looking at some of the longer term trends on some of that. And then looking at some of the summary background information we've got about the population and where people are and particular patterns in terms of concentrations of people at a broader and then also a more granular level. So we'll be talking about who's around in terms of population, who's engaging in terms of the audience, some other contextual information that kind of fleshes that out, have a bit of a chat about that, and then think about what that might mean when we put it all together. And of course, all of this is happening in this quite interesting and challenging moment in terms of arts engagement, where we've had COVID and the impact of that, and that's had all sorts of changes on the types of people that are engaging and why they engage and how much and what to. And now we've got the cost of living crisis, which is having similarly profound effects, but potentially affecting different groups of people. So we're going to see how those two different, if you like, sets of gears are kind of meshing together in terms of the machinery of how audiences are behaving. Yeah, that's a one overblown metaphor for the day. Let's see how many more we find on the way through. But yeah, so we've got these two different issues basically in play in terms of COVID and cost of living, really quite different between them, as we'll see. Now, a bunch of what we talk about today will be based on Audience Spectrum. This is our segmentation tool, which explains different groups of people within the population split out into these 10 groups. Some of you will be super familiar with this probably, but some of you may not. So we want to presume you are. So we'll just do a quick run through of Audience Spectrum, what it is, how it works. So we then refer to some of these segments on the way through. I will zoom in particularly on 3 segments that are particularly prominent in London. But we'll reference other ones on the way through as well. So apologies if this is familiar to you, but obviously you need everyone to know what we're talking about, otherwise it'll be a very strange conversation. So, in Spectrum, allocates each household across the whole of the country into one of these 10 groups based on the patterns of cultural engagement that that we've observed from national survey data, and that we've grouped into, broadly speaking, higher, medium, and lower engaged groups. So our higher engaged groups is these three here, our medium engaged groups, these three here, and our lower engaged groups, these four here. Within each of those three sort of, if you like, top tier bands, they have quite different characteristics between the different segments. So particularly, and London is blessed in that it has three groups that are very highly present in London, and two of them are two of the really highly engaged groups. So we've got metroculturals, very heavily concentrated in London, sort of urban professionals of varying sorts. Of course, there are subgroups under all these as well, if you want loads of extra detail, but maybe save that for later. So the metroculturals, sort of affluent metropolitan professionals, experience seekers tend also to be university graduates, often a little bit younger, more likely to be maybe on the edges of the city. Both of these groups are engaged in quite a variety of arts and culture, but experience seekers, it's probably more of a skew towards a greater diversity of art forms and more kind of contemporary art forms, more kind of experimentally type things, whereas metroculturals, they're picking off the best of the best, but are quite broad ranging in their cultural confidence. And both groups are quite sort of self-identified in terms of being cultural. So we will see some of this other group, community land culture buffs, this kind of highly engaged but much more kind of new to land, hence the name, but sort of older, a little bit more traditional, big mainstay, maybe more regional audiences, but still quite a few of them sort of coming in from the areas, from the home counties into London. We then see quite a few of these middle engaged groups, some of which have higher concentrations of families in them, so like Dorothy, Pendables, Trips and Treats, who tend to be a little bit more rural, a little bit more sort of small towny, a little bit older, a little bit younger, respectively. And then we will have less to do really with this group, home and heritage, which tends to be a bit more rural, a bit older, more traditional. Which, when we see the figures later, is probably quite a good thing from your perspective, because they're really not engaging that much at the moment. And then we've got a variety of lower engaged groups, some of which maybe sort of have a skew towards, for example, northern towns, so concentrations of upper streets in some of those areas, supported communities, a tendency, people in various types of either sort of supported housing or sheltered housing or council housing, with a big concentration of those being sort of relatively older and potentially infirms, but minority who are a bit younger. Front families, lots of lower income family groups particularly. But then the other key group that's quite big in London is kaleidoscope creativity. And this group's quite varied in the way that it sort of manifests across the country. But it's relatively diverse in terms of as a group. It's a tendency to sort of people living in quite urban areas, often in sort of flats and sort of built up little tower blocks and things for some of them, or kind of the other subgroup of those is a little less kind of tower blocky and a little bit more sort of still edging towards more settled communities, but it tends to be, if you like, kind of it's a big chunk of the London population, so a third from London. So for each of these segments, there's a whole load of more information on our website, which will give you a bit of detail about sort of how much they engage, how much of the data sets we've got they tend to account for. And then for each of them, there's like summary information about who they are, what they do, what they're interested in, what their attitudes are, what kind of comms they prefer, what sorts of messages they might respond to, where they are, etc. So all of these things you see here, you sort of expand out in much more detail. Then each one has these kind of two subtypes. So there'll be some within this group who skew in one direction, and others sort of skew in a different direction. So, for example, experience seekers, we see lots of them, but some of them are much more likely to be much younger and still students. Some of them are a little bit older and starting to sort of settle down a bit. So, does anyone have any spectrum questions or any sort of general intro questions before we get on to looking at who we've got in the local area and what they are doing? Fab was an intro as well. Lovely. So, great. In which case, I'll pass across to Isaac to take us through the first bit about us, the background population. Move on to more about local attendance.
Yes. Hello. Yeah, if we could start with the slide, please. Is it? What are you doing there?
Yeah.
Great. So just a very brief overview. Firstly, this is the area that we mean by South East London. So it has the more central boroughs like Southwark, Lewisham, Greenwich, and then these bigger boroughs that are a bit further out, like Bexley and by far the largest Bromley. We're just going to look at their demographics and particular hotspots within them, and audience spectrum, go into a fair amount of detail about what their profiles are, picking out specific ones and some of the larger segments which have already been mentioned. If we can. So who's actually in South East London? So here we've got some charts with the outer ring is South East London, and the inner ring is the comparison of London, because we find it's easiest to compare bits of London to just London, really, because it's such a unique city. So we have kind of perhaps unsurprisingly, there's one of the overrepresented groups, which we'll talk about a fair amount, is Black or Black British groups, which is higher even compared to the London average, whereas the Asian British population tends to be a bit lower. And then there's even more of the kind of mixed and kind of other groups. In terms of education, it's pretty similar, to be honest, to the rest of London, where we kind of have some of the higher education, higher diplomas is a bit lower than the rest of London, but not by much. And then in terms of some big groups of like families, retirees and students, this is also quite similar to the London benchmark. So we're having around around a quarter of people are in families, same as London, about 7% retirees, which is similar, and also students tend to be about 6% of the population, though in this area quite focused in areas, especially Southwark. Go on. Right, if we can go to the next slide. So as Ollie kind of alluded to, this area is quite dominated by the three particular segments. So starting with metroculturals, this very highly engaged group. Although you see in this chart, so we also have bars in London and then the UK, which is very different on average. But with metroculturals, South East London is actually a fair bit lower compared to the kind of average in London, because of a lot of the central London places that are especially dominant. But then experience seekers are another big group. They're higher than the London on average and much higher than the UK. And then by far the biggest group is this Kaleidoscope creativity, which Ollie mentioned, that are in things like tower blocks and the kind of lower engaged, tend to be kind of lower income, but still engaged in particular parts of culture, which as you see is very dominant in London, and our area is quite similar to the rest of London. And then we have kind of a smattering of the other segments, but really only kind of community and culture buffs and a bit of dormitory dependables from the further out of the centre are the other kind of segments that have got a bit of influence. So as Ollie briefly mentioned, there are actually sub-segments within these where we can split it much further, which is helpful, especially in areas where there are big dominant segments. So we see, for instance, that metroculturals, you see this split between 12 and 9, that it's slightly more of these younger, mobile, emerging metropolitan professionals, make up a bit more of the audience than the much older, established sort of professional elites. Within experience seekers, it's slightly higher for these kind of midlife professionals of the very varied artistic tastes. But there's also a decent chunk that are a lot more studenty, which is the other half of experience seekers, which we'll come to. And within kaleidoscope creativity, it's a lot more dominant in this K2 group, which is the kind of tower block kind of living, which is, we see as a lot more common in London compared to the smaller group which is only kind of 9%.
Just to flag the slide then, updating.
Yes, sorry, the description there is updated. So that's from another segment, which is actually part of the picture here in terms of the commuter belt, but that belongs to commuters and culture buffs, which do obviously travel into the city, which you see this kind of 8% of. But yeah, the kaleidoscope creativity are by far the biggest segment here overall.
Yeah. And just to note, we'll update that when we circulate the slides, but also to say we will circulate the slides. So
yes, yeah, we'll send all this through. So don't worry about memorizing any of the charts or anything. This is just a good overview. So yeah, if you want to find out more about them, head to the website. You can have a real look at everything about those subsegments within the area. And just generally in terms of going into the actual boroughs, so the biggest is Bromley, the one that's kind of further on the outside of London, which as I mentioned and as was briefed on the side, that this has the most or the highest percentage of commuter and culture buffs, which are a fairly big chunk of the audience, especially from Bromley, but in the local venues, you'll see that's quite a big chunk of people coming in. Bromley also has the highest number of retirees. Southwark, also a big ward, has by far the highest metroculturals in kaleidoscope creativity. So it's really the kind of most extreme ward, borough, sorry, where that's basically metroculturals and kaleidoscope creativity basically make up almost the entire audience of the borough, but with a few experience seekers probably made up of students, because that's quite high in Southwark as well. Lewisham is the kind of experience seekers ward, with also quite a lot of families is the highest, and it's the highest for Black British residents as well. Greenwich is kind of an in-between borough. It's got kind of quite a lot of bits of, it's kind of quite medium for a lot of the different segments, so it has kind of a bit of everything going in between along the river. It is highest for the Asian British population, which we'll see some mapping on, as well as Black British. And Bexley, this is our kind of dormitory dependables ward. It's quite dominant on this kind of middle-engaged segment, which isn't tend to be quite as active in the local, many of the local venues, but it is active, for instance, in the venues in Bexley itself. So if we can move on. And here I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Elise, who's going to talk a bit more about by ward level and different parts of the population.
Thanks, Isaac. Hi again, everyone. And before we move on to this lovely, colourful chart, I just want to address what I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Shanae said in the chat about yes, if we pulled out the profile of Southwark, Lewisham and Greenwich separately from Bromley and Bexley, it will look very different. And we'll see a bit more about that at audience level when we look at that further in the presentation. But that's absolutely a correct assumption. And it's a big thing that we're going to see again and again through this presentation, is really the difference between those inner boroughs and those outer boroughs. And we're seeing that a little bit here. So what you're looking at here is a bar chart essentially of every single ward in our Southeast London area. And then we've colored those wards by those boroughs. And it's showing the percentage of the population that is Black or Black British. That is census data. Census from the previous census, not the new one. We don't have that yet. But yeah, the percentage of the population. So you see the highest ward goes up to 50%, about 50%. That's Peckham, maybe unsurprisingly to some people. And then all the way down to close to 0% for those Bromley wards at the end. And the color coding really shows you this sort of divide where you've got the yellow and red wards all the way to the right, Bromley and Bexley, to the exception of a few of those Greenwich wards. And you've got really Southwark and Lewisham all the way to the left, and then Greenwich is kind of spread out, but a bit concentrated in the middle. So on this one key measure, which is the Black and Black British population, we're really seeing how those boroughs are really spread out and really behave quite distinctively and have quite distinctive populations, and therefore, as we'll see later, different audiences really. So that's just kind of one way to visualize those differences, not on audience spectrum, but on a different measure. And on the next slide, we'll see a different view of this same ethnicity measure, still from the census data. And we're looking at Black and Black British and Asian British as two groups, because we saw in one of the first charts that they're quite significant portions of the population, especially compared to the rest of the UK. And so this is showing you, this is a map of the area, and you're seeing the top wards, so the wards with the most, the highest percentage of those populations. And in orange, you see the top wards for Black or Black British, and in blue, the top wards for Asian or Asian British, and then in purple, if they're in the top for both. So we're seeing, and then in the circles and the writing on the side are telling you which ones are the actual top ones. The top three essentially. So we're seeing again, Peckham being the top for Black and Black British, and then this area around Thamesmead and Old Kent Road. So a little pocket in Greenwich is sticking out, but otherwise it's really central. And for Asian and Asian British, it's more along the river. And you have areas like Woolwich and Plumstead being the highest. I don't actually know where Plumstead is, but maybe it will speak to you and your local knowledge. But really what we're seeing here is that real concentration towards the river and the center of London, and if it's expanding out, it's expanding east rather than south. So again, if you work with these sorts of populations in your work, or if they're a key part of your audience, or indeed a part of your audience that you're looking to attract more of, this might be an interesting view and an interesting thing to think about. And the next slide, we're going to go back to thinking about audience spectrum. As we saw, they're kind of audience spectrum is kind of an interesting shorthand for thinking about different populations, and this is really showing us where those different types of engagers are. So we're seeing those metroculturals very, very central, essentially Southwark and a little bit of Greenwich and a little bit of the north side of Lewisham. And can we just go back to the previous slide?
Sorry, just wait for that. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, and also Kaleidoscope Creativity, very much a lower engaged segment, but very central and in those, and it matches with those wards along the river. Oh, thanks about finding where Plumstead is. Thank you. But yeah, those wards along the river, actually where you would find Woolwich, is those kaleidoscope creativity, and it kind of matches on what we were seeing, where there's high concentration of Asian and Asian British and Black British populations. Experience seekers a bit more out of the center, around Greenwich, Woolwich area, Lewisham area, and then a little bit into Bromley and Bexley. But then really Bromley and Bexley are those commuter segments, dormitory dependables and commuter and culture buffs. And we have small pockets of frontline families and trips and treats. But really that's, again, it's really showing that divide between the central boroughs, are all of those top London segments, and then the boroughs further out behaving more like Kent and Essex and the rest of the south of England, outside of London. So this is probably quite familiar to a lot of you, this sort of divide of London into the inner boroughs, the outer boroughs that are part of London but behave very differently. But hopefully this view is kind of useful to see, if some of these are your key segments to engage with, this view of the population spread out like this might be quite useful. And in the next slide, we're going to take a similar look. The colors match, but we're looking at the top wards again. So experience seekers, those top wards are really around that Lewisham and the border of Lewisham and Bromley, Lewisham Central, and then the border with Bromley. Metroculturals really just in Southwark, in Dulwich and Goose Green. I never heard of that one either, but some fun names always with wards. And then kaleidoscope creativity, we're in Greenwich and also in Peckham, which echoes back to what we were saying before with the ethnicity map. So that's another way, if you're really looking, I mean, those are, apart from kaleidoscope creativity, but metroculturals and experience seekers are highly engaged segments. So it's always good to get a view of where exactly there do you have the most of them, and also it might be interesting for you to compare that with where you're getting more of your audience from. And just to finish on population data before we move on to audience data, we wanted to look at concentrations of families, retirees, and students in each ward. So this might look like a little bit of I don't know how I would describe it, a bit of a crazy plot, but essentially each dot on the chart is a ward, and it will be pulled further towards one of those corners if it has more families, if it has more retirees, or if it has more students, if that makes sense. And essentially what it's showing is those, again, yellow and red dots, Bromley and Bexley, are really being pulled towards retirees, the retiree corner. So they have more retirees, whereas Lewisham, Greenwich, and Southwark are a lot more spread out. And Southwark is really pulling towards the students' corner. So it has more students than it has retirees or families. And the wards that are pulling the most towards families are in Greenwich, and a little bit, you could say, Lewisham and some of the others. So really what this is showing us is, again, the difference in profile and in types of people who live in those boroughs. So we have this area that we've selected for Southeast London, but really it's made up of different populations in different boroughs, with Bromley and Bexley being more of the commuter land segments, more retirees, older population, and then Southwark being younger, more affluent, obviously as it's more central, more likely to have students, there's student halls and that sort of stuff. And Lewisham and Greenwich being more of a mixed picture, more of a diverse picture, and so on. So hopefully this gives you a good sort of general overview of who lives in the area, and this might be something you are already familiar with, or it might be new information that's very useful. And yeah, again, all of this will be available after the event, so you can always look back at it. And just quickly, I think, yeah, sorry, Ollie,
I just want to jump in just because for me, one of the things that strikes me as quite interesting about this, and this is as someone who doesn't live in London, so caveat, but the big cliche you always hear when you talk about London populations is this idea that everything's mixed in together and you've got lots of people all cheek by jowl and these big contrasting communities in quite small areas. But actually looking at this picture, we can see that at a ward, if you compare the wards and the boroughs, actually they are holding together pretty consistently. So we are seeing a fair amount of differentiation as opposed to it just being everything kind of churned up. So that strikes me as kind of potentially quite interesting. It may be true at a street level, but certainly when you get a little bit further out, commonality.
Yeah, and what often also comes up when looking at London by boroughs is that the borough boundaries, we know they're quite historical and they don't necessarily match groups of people and their behaviors and their makeup and everything else. Yeah, I think just to finish on population, we can go over this very quickly, but this is just more in case it's useful. If any of you have like particular audience spectrum segments that you would like to drill down on, this is just a view of each spectrum segment and which wards have the highest concentration of them and that concentration. So it might be useful to you. It's useful to note the difference in concentration in those higher ones. So metroculturals, the highest ward is almost all metroculturals and nobody else. And similarly for kaleidoscope creativity, Abbey Wood is 78% kaleidoscope creativity, which I think is one of the highest concentrations in the country even, and for metroculturals as well. Whereas something like we saw there were a few wards that it was their dominant segment, but actually the highest concentration is 32%. It doesn't go higher than that. So that's just another view that's useful to put things into perspective. And also experience seekers, we said, it's one of the top 3 segments, but the highest ward has only 56% of it, whereas community and culture, both the highest wards have more of those. So it's interesting to think about when you look at a dominant segment, or I know on Audience Finder website you have access to a mapping by postal sector of concentration of each segment in each postal sector. Yeah, it's interesting to remember not just where people are, but in which concentration. So does anybody have any questions about population data that we've presented, or anything about the local population that needs clarifying, or you would like a bit more information on? Feel free to pop in the chat. Otherwise, we are going to move on to looking at your local audience and what we've been able to find out from looking at Audience Finder data, both ticketing and also from surveys, but I would say mainly from ticketing. So first of all, this is a view of the audience spectrum profile of the bookers that live in Southeast London, so in that whole area we've been looking at. And so these are people who live in that area and who've been booking to anywhere in the country through that we have the data through in Audience Finder. So of course it's not every single booker, but we do have a data set of about 100 organizations throughout the country, so it's pretty strong. And what we're seeing is in gray that profile we saw at the start of the population, and we're seeing again metroculturals they were already the second highest segment, and now they're massively overrepresented. And this is a very familiar picture for London. Experience seekers are also a little bit overrepresented. And kaleidoscope creativity, our top segment, is still quite present. It's still the 3rd biggest segment in the profile, which is really good for autism spectrum, since they're quite lower engaged, but compared to the population, they are quite underrepresented. I just saw your question, Keitha. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. There are more specific breakdowns on ethnicity data in our area profile reports. And I think you have one available of just the whole of London on our website. But you can also commission one of any particular area that you're interested in. But there's also a lot of websites online that give you information about census data at this mapped level. I recommend one called Data Sign. So you can look at that later. That would be my my recommendation, to look into more specifics. So back to Booker data. So yes, this is the view of who of this population is actually engaging and actually booking tickets to theaters and music venues and so on. The caveat is always with ticketing data that it's quite low on arts, on like heritage venues and museums. Those tend to capture that more through survey data, but that being said, there's still a pretty wide spread of organizations. And again, this is bookers from the area booking to elsewhere in London or the local venue. We'll see a bit more about that later. Yes, so this is the profile. And now we wanted to look at these people, when were they booking and also where. So this is a view of a whole year, typical year. I will say taken pre-COVID. We will look a little bit more about changing pictures later, but for now we're looking at before the pandemic. And it's showing you thousands of tickets sold by month. And the gray bar is showing sold to local bookers who are booking to local venues. And by local, we mean within Southeast London. So these are people who live in Southeast London and who are booking tickets to venues in Southeast London. And you have in purple there on the side, list of venues included in that local venues. And we're going to use that term quite a lot today. So yeah, this is just a little intro to what we mean by those venues. And these are just the venues we have available to us in Audience Finder. And if you're a local venue and you're not in that list and you would like to be, then you can absolutely sign up. It's free for anyone to sign up to Audience Finder and contribute data. And you get lots of exciting insights in return, like this. So gray bar, local bookers to local venues, and then green bar is non-local bookers to local venues. So bookers from outside Southeast London booking to those local venues that we have listed here. So you can see already that's a pretty stark picture. That's a lot higher. Maybe that might surprise some of you, maybe not. But what we'll say from having done a lot of these events throughout the country is that this is quite an unusual picture, and this is very specific to London. This behavior pattern of usually the local bookers are the main audience to venue, but here it's much more of a wider spread, and that of course is because people travel from anywhere in London to visit any venue in London. And you have in orange local bookers to non-local venues, so venues outside Southeast London, and that could be anywhere in the country, but of course it's mainly elsewhere in London, in central London, and then other neighbouring boroughs. And we can see this is still quite a high number of tickets, but nowhere near the amount coming in from outside the local area. And there's a pretty simple explanation to this in just the volume of people living in London, and there are just a lot living all around London, outside Southeast London. So that comes part of the way in explaining why those green bars are so high compared to the other ones. Sorry, Ali, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to throw in the other thing to note is that a couple of the venues that we've got in here, places like the Bridge and Shakespeare Globe, etc., will be venues that have a really quite broad, not just kind of across the city, but across a much wider hinterland, and indeed internationally in some cases. So that's part of what we're driving it.
Absolutely, yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
I noted this doesn't include international data, in fact, but
Yes, we don't have international data in the ticketing data set. We'll touch a tiny bit on overseas visitors when we look at the survey data. Yes, this is just giving you an overview of also the fluctuation of bookings by month, where we can see the local bookers booking locally a lot more in December. Of course, as it's pantomime season and people just tend to stay very local for pantomime. But also those local bookers booking to non-local venues in that month, and that is of course people might be going home because this is locality is based on postcode, and so if someone based in Southeast London visits family elsewhere in England, they will be counted in that orange bar there. And the other thing to note is the spike in the summer of just bookers in general, but especially from outside the local area. So this might be something that you're already aware of if you're a local venue, and this might be quite a familiar picture, or maybe not, and it might be an interesting view to compare yourself to.
and it could be a tourist audience, I guess.
Yes, yeah. Very much so. So we're seeing those this flow in of non-local bookers to local venues, and this flow out of local bookers going outside the local area. And the next slide is just going to give a little summary of this, where you have here these. We've grouped those months by season just to give a bit of an overview. We're seeing a pretty steady but lower number of local people visiting outside the local area, and quite a high number of people coming in from outside the local area, with a spike in the summer. And so this net flow in and out is resulting in a positive net flow, as we said, just because London has such a big population, and also is a popular destination for people elsewhere in the country and abroad. And yeah, that spike in the summer could be due to different programming, it could be due to tourism, and so on. Now, if we look at our local venues in a bit more detail, and we drill down on exactly where elsewhere from Southeast London people are visiting, because it's quite a big area outside Southeast London. This is the view. This is a nice little stacked charts, where you've got Southeast London there in a textured bar at the bottom in blue, 23%. And again, this is a typical year pre-COVID. And then the next biggest is actually from outside London and the southeast. The rest of the UK, there's still 21%. So we see that pull from elsewhere, and of people visiting London as a destination and making a trip out of it, and so on. But still, we have 14% from southwest London, and these are defined by standard definitions of these boroughs. So southwest London is 14%, and 12% North London, and 7% from West London. So people are traveling quite far, and again, that might be those more central Southwark venues, most likely creating that pull. Not a lot of people from central London, because as we know, not a lot of people actually live in central London. But interestingly, not a lot actually from Kent and Essex, from the neighboring counties. So you have more people coming from rest of the country, rest of the southeast, and from the rest of London. You have more people from North London than from the neighboring counties in Kent and Essex. So that, of course, could be linked to the very good transport links around London. It's just easy to get around with the tube and so on. But it might be something that might surprise some of you if you were, thinking that there might be more people visiting from the neighboring counties. But this is just a breakdown a bit further of what we're seeing when we look at visitors from outside the local area. And yeah, if you tally it up, it's 1/3 of bookers to the local venues are from outside of London, which still says 2/3 are from within London. It's actually still pretty, if we expand our definition of local audience, it's still a pretty local audience. Now we're going to go back to looking at audience spectrum. And this is again our local, so now we're going back to looking at local bookers. So people who live in Southeast London. And we're looking at their profile depending on where they're visiting. So of course there's overlap in these profiles. They're not mutually exclusive because a local booker could have been to a local venue and to a venue in central London as well, and to a venue elsewhere in the UK. But essentially what we're seeing is that the local bookers who are booking to local venues, their profile is a lot more evenly spread, as much as it can be in this area, than local bookers booking to central London or the rest of London. So there's still a majority metroculturals, but a lot less than in central London and the rest of London. So this is a way to show us that the local metroculturals and the local experience seekers and kaleidoscope creativity, they tend to visit venues in central London or the rest of London more than they tend to visit their local venues and venues in the rest of the UK. And it's those middle engaged segments in the local area, which they're low, but we saw that there's still some, and they tend to visit more outside. They tend to be more present in the profile visiting outside of London, even though they still visit in London. I hope that wasn't a confusing, maybe that was a confusing way to present this, but I hope it makes sense. And yeah, sorry, Ollie, you were going to say something.
No, I do think it's quite an interesting thing, because I mean, it's partly about that spatial arrangement that we talked about before, with big concentrations of metrocultural experience seekers up towards the more inner London boroughs. It's probably partly about taste patterns, because they're probably more likely to be drawn by some of the kind of I don't know what to call it, but sort of, if you like, higher scale arty, kind of very arty stuff that might be put on at some of the very central London venues and sort of South Banky type places. So there's probably a bit of that going on, and there's probably also something about propensity to travel because they're more enthusiastic on average. So it's sort of interesting, because the Dawn Treat Pendles, Trips and Treats, you'd normally think that they would tend to go for high profile things as preference, but they're also less motivated to travel. I guess if they're a bit further out, they're less motivated to travel, they'll probably end up staying in the local area, but only for very particular things that are really kind of catching their eye. But yeah, it's a kind of interesting dynamic that listed there. Hopefully.
Okay. Thanks. I think you summarized it a lot more clearly than I did, but yes. Hopefully this is all useful information, and again, this is all available afterwards in a slide deck for you to look at. And if you just click on Ollie, I just added at the bottom the percentages in the local population. If you disappear, there we go. Just to remind ourselves that of what is in the local population, there 26% of the local population is kaleidoscope creativity, and yet the highest bar in that chart is just above 15. So it's also showing where potential is, that there's still that we're overrepresenting those top segments, metrocultural and experience seekers, but kaleidoscope creativity are still very underrepresented. But where they visit the most, if they do visit, tends to be elsewhere in London, outside the centre, outside the local area. So there's an extra interesting tidbit to think about. We're going to keep looking at our local audience, so local people. And this time we're going to split them out by borough, again, because we saw early on that people behave very differently by borough and they have different profile. Well, we saw they had different profile. Now we're seeing they actually behave differently as well. And this is showing that bookers from these local areas, which venues are they booking at? So this is showing a percentage of tickets, so volume of tickets. So what we're seeing is in Greenwich, 19% of the tickets bought by people in Greenwich were to local venues, and 24% were to venues in central London, and so on. So now that we have an overview of what this chart represents, what we're seeing is that those Bromley and Bexley boroughs are behaving very differently to Greenwich, Lewisham and Southwark, where the view is quite similar, although people in Southwark are booking more to the rest of London comparatively, and more to central London. And we're seeing, curiously, in Bexley, a lot of this pink bar is very large. And a part of it is that there aren't any big performing arts venues in Bexley in the same way that there are in the other places. So what I find interesting is that they're more likely to go to the rest of the UK than to somewhere else in London outside of the local area. And that's really where we see that they are really on the edge of London and will behave more like the rest of the southeast. And Bromley, of course, sorry.
So can I throw in a question on that, which you may or may not have the answer to hand, but just thinking back to where we didn't see a huge proportion overall going to Kent and Essex and the like, but it feels like that, if anywhere is again getting higher numbers heading in that direction, it may be Bexley.
Yeah.
Does that stack up in terms of?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it probably, what we're not showing here is the proportion of the audience that is from each of these boroughs. So we're missing that information of it. It might be that those bookers from Bexley are dwarfed by just the volume of bookers from Southwark, Lewisham and Greenwich, and to an extent Bromley. I would hazard a guess that they're a smaller proportion of the overall bookers. But if you're an organization based around there, it might be interesting information. And Bromley, it has the highest proportion of bookers staying locally, and it's because they have a strong local venue that people who live further out have less transport links into central. They might be more likely to stay booking at their local venue, more than it's a higher incentive to do that than for people who live in Southwark or Greenwich. But as this is where I out myself as a North Londoner, because to me Lewisham is already very far out of the centre. So it was surprising to me that they also are to quite a large extent travelling to the rest of London. But there's always that thing that people from North London think that the south of London is so fast and poorly connected, and there's the opposite view as well for South Londoners. But so yeah, I have the data here to prove me wrong that Lewisham is actually quite well connected, and people will travel to a very large extent into central and into North and West London as well, and East London. So this is a view by local authority. We're going to stay looking at local bookers and in similar charts, but this time splitting it by season. So, oops, I think we skipped one. So we're looking at still local bookers, and when are they booking more to their local venues or to elsewhere? And what this is showing us is, again, slightly higher local bookings in the winter, and also slightly higher local central London bookings in autumn, maybe linked to theatre seasons or that sort of thing. And it's a higher proportion of bookings to outside of London in the summer, so traveling out, maybe visiting other places. So this is just an overview, but really we're not seeing a huge changes, which matches what we've seen earlier on when we were looking at local bookers to local venue. Was quite a steady sort of line of bars, steady bar proportions in bar charts. Yeah, so it's just another way to view that. And finally, in the same view, we're going to look at art forms. And this is, again, local bookers. Where are they booking? Split by art form. So people in Southeast London who booked for film mainly did it in central London rather than the local area, might be linked to offer. And again, this is just organizations we have in Audience Finder, so it probably doesn't include the local view or Cineworld. It will be arts organizations that contribute to Audience Finder who are putting on film. So maybe something like the Barbican or those sort of venues. Yeah, again, we're seeing Christmas shows being very much a local affair, either local or rest of the UK. So either they're staying local or they're local to wherever they're visiting family or something like that during the holidays. We're seeing plays and drama being the highest amount in the rest of London, which is interesting when central London, pretty sure we, yes, includes the West End. So so there's something there about some key venues outside of the West End bringing in a lot of tickets from bookers in Southeast London, but not.
We have commercial West End in the data set
as well. Yes, yeah, of course, yeah, but dance and music, higher proportions in central London compared to plays and drama, but not as much as film. So this, again, depending on the kind of venue that you work in or the kind of work that you do, it might be, yeah, it might be interesting. And that bar at the end there, general entertainment, that includes stuff like comedy and that sort of stuff. Like, I think tribute acts, maybe, that sort of thing. Yeah, so and then other ticketing is just everything else. So it could be children, family shows, outdoor arts, that sort of thing. You're going to say something?
Because there's a question from Lucy in the chat saying, does it include participation data? It does include workshops and things where they're ticketed through venues. But of course, there's all sorts of participatory activity by organisations which won't necessarily be organisations that then feed into Audience Finder. So there is a substantial amount of workshop data in here, but it's by no means the whole picture.
Yes.
Particularly the more community level, so community level arts organisations will tend not to be here.
So that workshops would be included in that other ticketing bar, but grouped together with other art forms. But we're seeing it being slightly more local than other art forms, so that's interesting, and it might be, yeah, might be conclusive. Just quickly to finish on those visitings to local venues, we have a map in the next slide that, there we go, that shows, again, another view of where bookers are coming from to those local venues. And it's also showing you the concentration of bookers in the various wards also within the local venues. So we're seeing that big concentration around Lewisham and then Southwark and Greenwich, but not the hyper centre, which makes sense. according to where people live. And then outside the local venue, we can really see that ring around central London. And it's really all around those zones 2 and 3 in London. And then spreading out in lower concentrations, but still spreading out to really a lot of the south, and then all the way to Brighton even, and then north in those along those commuter corridors, St Albans and etc. Yeah, some areas we can see if in London, in the neighboring boroughs, it's really that adjacent south area that is quite that is quite engaged. So to the west of to the west of Southwark and Lewisham, which would be not off the top of my head, but you probably know, around the Brixton area, the west of Peckham and all that. And just to finish on audiences, where I promised a small overview of survey data, and here are just a few bits to sink your teeth into. So again, back on ethnicity, because this is something that we have in the survey data that we don't have with ticketing. Any visitor who fills out a survey is asked if they consent to give their ethnic background. And so these are visitors, again, split by borough, who filled out a survey to anywhere really, but if they were visiting from that area, they were counted. And so we're seeing a more white profile than in the local population. And the more ethnically diverse boroughs are, of course, the more central ones. Lewisham and Southwark and Greenwich to some extent, but less than maybe might be expected, seeing their population profile. And we saw they were quite a big hub for Asian and Asian British population, and we're not seeing those in particularly high amounts in the survey data. So this might be an interesting view to compare and contrast with the population data if Asian British people are a key audience, or you're looking to make them a key audience for you. And similarly for Black and Black British audience members, they're quite underrepresented compared to how present they are in the population. And this is, of course, I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone, because this is what we're seeing historically throughout the arts sector. And then looking at the two charts on the right are looking at local organizations. So organizations in Southeast London, a different list than the one we presented at the start. Sorry, I didn't include it here. But venues in Southwark have more first-time visitors, whereas venues in Lewisham have more repeat visitors. And frequent just means they've been before in the last year, and lapsed means they have been before, but more than a year ago. And again, this was all pre-COVID. So this is just a small overview, and also, as promised, information about overseas visitors. And we're seeing more overseas visitors for Southeast London organizations than for London as a whole. And that's quite interesting, because we would expect to see more compared to the UK as a whole, but compared to London venues, that's quite a strong picture. And again, this will include more museums and that sort of thing. Ollie?
Am I right in thinking this one of the venues contributing would be Tate, which might be a factor?
Yes, includes Tate Modern. Yes.
Yeah. So.
Which Lewisham boroughs the data is based on? I'm not sure.
That's been corrected to the Lewisham venues.
Oh, sorry.
Lewisham venues.
Okay.
Good point.
I don't have that information to hand. Isaac,
I will look it up and work out which.
So,
worth noting, this is on the left. It is looking at people, survey respondents from Lewisham.
On the left,
Yes.
the ethnicity is yes, but
Yeah.
the ones on the right are local, venues in Lewisham.
And we haven't got the full all of the organisations there, but just to say, it's ones like the Tate is quite a big one, the Horniman Museum, and the Film and Video Umbrella. These are kind of some of the big ones. South London Gallery, there, so kind of some of the big contributing organisations. But there's about 15 or 20 here that have contributed. So.
Yes. So this is not, we don't have the list by borough, but we could pull it up.
Looking at the how things have changed since the before times, we can start off looking at sort of an aggregate level, and then we'll get into looking at a more granular picture in terms of which audiences are doing what. So start off with where we're looking. So here is us looking at organisations that are in the data set before and after COVID. So we've got kind of comparable such data as venues in the local area, and it's looking at 1819 and 1920 data on average compared to essentially a recent year's worth of data running from November to October 2021 to 2022. So it's equivalent, annual figures with a full averaged compared to the other, and we can look at the overall level of engagement. And what we're seeing here essentially is that there has been, on average, across the year, a drop in engagement compared to before of just over a quarter. So a substantial decrease. It's less of a decrease than we've seen across the country as a whole. I think worth noting. So it's not too bad, but it is obviously still substantial. And we're seeing a slightly smaller drop in terms of number of tickets per performance. So what that means essentially is that the number of performances has dropped to kind of account for the fact there's less engagement. So each performance is probably relatively slightly fuller on average, and just there's less often. No, sorry, I've garbled that. Isaac was too polite to interrupt and go, what are you talking about? So the average ticket performance has also dropped, but a drop in performances has meant that it's not dropped as much. That's a more accurate way of putting it, and that's what you can see in the third chart. So a small drop in performances accounts for that difference. That's the local organisation picture, and we can then look at local bookers. So bookers in the area as opposed to venues in the area, and we can see there has been also a drop here, but it's nowhere near as big a drop. So less than 10% drop in terms of local bookers. So what appears to have happened is that, yes, people are attending less, but where they're really cutting back on attendance is attending locally. It's either people locally not attending locally as much relative to travelling out to other areas, but also fewer people travelling in from other areas. So again, this is a slightly decreased use of public transport, and some of those links dropping. So that's why we're seeing kind of a drop overall, and a drop local, because in general, because people are going up to other places but maybe not travelling in. So the other thing we can look at is what's the trend in terms of who's engaging relatively more or less. And now this rather strange looking roller coaster is essentially showing the change compared to 2016-17 for all the different audience spectrum segments. So if we set the 2016-17 result for each segment to 100, then does that proportion, whatever it was to start with, go up or down relative to that starting point? And what we see is, on the run-up to the pandemic, there was a bit of an increase, largely across the board, although interestingly not so much for home and heritage, but particularly frontline families, experience seekers, and trips and treats. Some of the segments that we'll see later on are actually doing quite well coming out of the pandemic. So there is this kind of interesting paradox where a lot of the post-pandemic picture is in some ways a kind of amplification of pre-pandemic trends. So we're seeing some of those groups engaging more, but once we go through the kind of the roller coaster of the pandemic itself, trips and treats then come out relatively ahead. So the family groups rise towards the top. Some of the older groups dip down towards the bottom, but worth noting that some of them were relatively near the bottom in the first place, so they weren't growing as much. So we are seeing a bit of a shift towards younger, more family audiences, and particularly a bit of a difference with think of some of those highly engaged groups where the experience seekers and metroculturals levels are relatively speaking holding up, and community land culture costs dropping away a bit. So that's the kind of overall picture we're seeing in terms of overall trend. So if you like, that's the journey people have been on, and we'll see it split out as well, just in terms of overall picture. So this is just a sort of like a one proportion per segment of where they are relative to pre-pandemic levels. And this is re-emphasizing the point really. This is the end of where those bars got to, or the lines got to on the previous one, where some of the family groups were looking above average, above the previous pre-pandemic level, particularly chops and treats, closed group frontline families, and notably closed group creativity, big group in this area, big group in London, and experience seekers holding up really well, and holding up better locally than they are nationally, again, which might be a thing of interest. But we are seeing some fairly big drops elsewhere across the profile. Now, the home and heritage, there's not loads in this area, but their engagement levels have really kind of taken a big hit, and it's a bigger hit elsewhere than here. Again, maybe worth noting that again we're sort of seeing the South East London audience hold up relatively speaking, even for equivalent types of people. But the metroculturals are substantially down, sort of 14% down, which, given how big a group they are in terms of engagement, is a lot of effectively it's a lot of lost sales, even though it's not a massive proportionate difference. There's such a big group, there's such an important group, that again you boost the point of feeling that big quite a bit. Some of these other groups that are engaging more, trips and treats, frontline families, they're smaller parts of the audience anyway. So yeah, a boost in their engagement is nice, but it's by no means compensating for the drops you're seeing in some of these other groups. Okay, so again, just looking at sort of a picture across the year, because we know it's been quite a kind of a volatile year in terms of sales. What we've seen in a wider national picture is that there was very much a kind of catching up process up to kind of late spring, early summer, and then a dropping off again relative to before. We see a version of that here, but it's by no means as pronounced. So we're not seeing a kind of really sort of sharp contrast. It's just, the figures are a bit down, but they kind of catch up a bit in that period. It is worth noting that the April figure, which looks like it's the strongest kind of post-pandemic performance, is in some ways inflated because the pre-pandemic figure was actually a little bit down because of very particular things about individual venues being open or shut. So you wouldn't think that's different. It's sort of too prominent. But we do get, broadly speaking, a shortfall turning into a catching up, turning back into a bit of a shortfall on previous figures. But by no means as extreme as elsewhere. And again, this is sort of emphasised if you look at the overall ticket sales figures. They get a bit more of a gap in terms of ticket sales than there were in terms of bookers. Again, it's partly because people may be coming back, but coming back less often. So you're sort of seeing the sort of ticket numbers maybe not quite as kind of bullish as the overall audience numbers. Again, it's something to bear in mind. We've had, we ourselves, but also I think lots of people in the sector have been talking a lot about, is such and such an audience coming back? But it's also about frequency. It's not just about whether they actually make it through the door. Okay, and then this is looking at the relative picture, looking across this last year, where people are coming from, and again, it was higher numbers certainly through that kind of summer period, or sort of spring summer period from non-local areas, but actually the proportions were probably highest locally for December, as we talked about, but then holding up pretty well through that sort of spring summer period, but just picking up a bit later on. So it looks like people are travelling in more, and the local audience is maybe softening, relatively speaking, a bit more in more recent months. And obviously, as we get the later data on this, November, December, January, we'll start to see whether there is more of a kind of local impact of that cost of living starting to bite around that period, as we may expect to see. So, I think this is over to Isaac. Right.
Yes, it is. So now for something a bit different. So quite kind of aside from all of our data about the local area and all that sort of thing, we also run this cultural participation monitor, which is a nationally representative survey we do of a few thousand people sort of every quarter or so, with the last one being around September last year. And we do that to really drill into people's cultural opinions on things, especially like the recovery from COVID and things like that, and their attendance and cost of living. And basically we can drill into specific segments and particular parts of the population, or London as it may be. So we're going to look at a little bit to see whether the very dominant segments in your area or in London are doing things differently from the population of the UK in terms of their opinions on certain things. So this first chart is this willingness to attend. So this is kind of our post-COVID recovery measure, just asking people whether they have reservations still about attending, essentially. And what we find is that Kaleidoscope Creativity does have a lower willingness to attend, and Metroculturals, interestingly, and London itself is about around the average. But we do find that sorry, there's a buzz in the background, that's my door going. We do find that they're actually not comfortable or interested is where you do see the Metroculturals, this really highly engaged group, being quite a bit lower. So Metroculturals don't go as far as saying I'm not interested because of COVID. They just are kind of around the averages on that. And it's similar for London. London kind of matches quite a lot of the rest of the country and stuff, in terms of people from London saying they have some reservations still, around a quarter, but over half now saying no reservations. Go to the next slide. So this is a different part of the cultural CPM, just looking at any sort of arts engagement or online engagement or creative engagement in the past year, just asking people what they've taken part in, of which experience seekers are the most were more likely to have taken part in arts and heritage or creative activity, whilst Metroculturals are really quite significantly higher when you look at online arts or heritage activities. That's like 72% versus 57%. They're really quite a lot higher. But your groups in the local area really outperform on online stuff, in terms of you've sort of like 70% across, whether it's London or Kaleidoscope Creativity, really interested in online stuff. But whereas across in person, that's pretty on the national averages. And creative activities, again, a lot of the local groups, so experience seekers and Kaleidoscope Creativity, are really do a lot of everyday creativity, in terms of they're quite a lot higher than the national averages on these things. If we could move on to the third one. And of course, the big topic at the moment is the cost of living, and will probably remain to be such a big topic. So we're really drilling into that. The last big survey we did, and we'll continue to do so in the next survey. And this is just looking at various statements of different groups, whether they're agreeing with these. Perhaps unsurprisingly, metroculturals are not expecting to be as affected by the cost of living crisis. Whilst Kaleidoscope Creativity are more worried. We see sort of about 5% or 4 or 5% higher percentage for Kaleidoscope Creativity being worried. And this is otherwise kind of pretty standard in terms of London is pretty much on the averages nationally in terms of creeping up towards sort of half the people asked were agreed they were worried. And this measure, which we'll briefly talk about again in a sec, they're expecting to do fewer paid for entertainment activities, is pretty standard across the groups of like London and Kaleidoscope Creativity, but you see metroculturals are a bit lower on expecting to do less activities, and also on looking for more free things we find as well. And we're also seeing a bit of a trend of people saying they're going to stay closer to home for entertainment and leisure activities because of, I guess, transport costs and these sorts of things, which hopefully maybe we'll see a little bit of a shift as things like obviously petrol is coming down and that sort of thing. So perhaps we'll see a bit of a shift on that, but that seems to be one of the trends we're seeing.
Does the proportion saying they strongly agree with these statements? I think you're like worried about the cost of living.
Yes, yeah, in terms of being very strongly agreeing.
Yeah.
Yes.
The really large population agree that they're worried about cost of living, but this is the kind of strongly agree. So
yes, a strongly agree measure where you start to see a bit of differences in the local area in terms of strongly agreeing with these things. But yeah, as Ollie says, the people saying they do agree just overall is a lot higher in terms of people being worried. Yeah.
And it's maybe worth noting that when people say they're worried, what that worry means for different people will be different. So if you want a relatively higher income or relatively lower income, like the worry might be, oh, I might need to just be a little bit more careful on my Waitrose shop, as opposed to, a much more sort of severe concern about, how they're going against me.
Which will of course affect what arts people go to, if at all. Yeah. So just sort of smattering of other things about the segments across the survey. We find metroculturals are more likely to take a moderate approach with managing the risks of COVID. So 45% of them are saying they'll try to reduce the risk but not go too far, which is sort of 6% higher than the general population. Something about experience seekers, they quite a lot more likely to have booked to see a live show in the next few months, chiming with their kind of broad tastes. The things that live shows are quite popular with them. With Kaleidoscope Creativity is a very dominant segment across London. They have an interesting picture in terms of art forms. They say they have attended sort of in the past 12 months and also pre-pandemic. So they're the highest of all the segments in terms of attending outdoor festivals and street arts. They're a good like 10% higher than the general population, and also children and family events. They're like 40% have said they've been attending them versus 28% of the population. So something to focus on, kind of an opportunity if you can, with such a dominant segment in the area, as I'm sure some organisations in the area do. In terms of Black British, they're actually slightly higher engagement in terms of likeliness to engage with arts and culture, but pretty close to the national average. But in regards to return after COVID-19, they're significantly more likely to have reservations about attending. On that measure we saw briefly before about saying I have reservations about attending arts and culture, where they're sort of nearly 10% higher than the general population in terms of reservations. And just London overall is sort of mostly in line with national averages in terms of engagement, and maybe very slightly more cautious about COVID-19, but pretty much on the average London in terms of actually the attitudes to COVID-19. We don't tend to see dramatic differences across geography in terms of being cautious.
And that last one might be sort of affected a bit by the metroculturals who are
yes, that are a little bit more worried with the very like elite sort of thing. So here finally we just have a chart which combines kind of a bit of our data with the CPM data. So going along the y-axis, we have the changes compared to pre-COVID in our local area. So what's actually happening with segments in your local area. So as we showed, metroculturals and commuter and culture buffs are down, whereas kaleidoscope activity are pretty much at 100% compared to pre-COVID. And on the other axis along the bottom is those strongly agreeing that they'll do fewer paid for activities because of the cost of living crisis. So what we're kind of seeing is a kind of trend, a diagonal trend going upwards, where the right at the bottom is kind of commuter and culture buffs. They in the local area, they're an outlier in terms of not saying they're going to do less sort of paid for activities. They're happy to keep going to things, but they're a fair bit down, and similar to metroculturals, a fair bit down in the area, which is obviously slightly concerning. Whereas kaleidoscope creativity, which is at around 100% of pre-COVID levels, they're more likely to agree they'll do a fewer paid for activities. And right up at the top, we have these kind of opportunities that obviously trips and treats aren't enormously high in the area, but they are in some wards, and they are really doing well compared to pre-COVID, but they're even sort of slightly higher with agreeing they're going to do fewer paid for activities. So it's a bit of a catch-22 potentially emerging with some of the segments that are coming back more being a bit more worried. But yeah.
And I guess that's emphasising the thing that I mentioned earlier on about these two different factors and the fact that they're clashing against each other. Because
yes,
broadly there's a trend line going up and right.
Yeah,
that gives us that problem. Whereas if it was in the opposite direction, where it was dropping,
yeah,
that'd be giving us a kind of like, well, it's really kind of creating opportunities in the people who are most likely to be most engaged already, and so you get this kind of
yes, this
quite challenging.
Yeah, challenging trend that we want to keep an eye on, that the audiences coming back and the highest numbers aren't going to be more worried, and sort of anything we can do to tempt them back or with pricing and all sorts of things is important, because they're family groups and things are the ones that are dominating at the moment. So I'll pass back over to Ollie for the last bit.
So just try and draw a few of these threads together, and then you have a chance to get your reflections as well, and see whether what we're saying kind of matches what you're experiencing in practice, and sort of make questions. So just to recap, we've got obviously lots of these three segments we've talked about a lot today: metrocultural experience seekers, kaleidoscope creativity, but particularly metrocultural kaleidoscope creativity pushing slightly further towards the centre. Some of the experience seekers just a little bit further down in terms of the main concentrated areas. Some of these groups are particularly important by volume, and you saw that in the size of the bubbles on that last chart. Metrocultural is really big as an audience group in terms of attendance, despite that drop that we've seen sort of post-COVID. Community land culture buffs also, in those more kind of sort of coming into the home counties or from the sort of further edges of this area, from Bexley and Bromley, really important groups overall. Kaleidoscope creativity, really big chunk of the population, a little bit underrepresented, perhaps unsurprisingly. They are after all a sort of lower engaged group on average, but nonetheless maybe some opportunities around that. We're seeing this really, what I think is a kind of curious and quite an interesting travel pattern in terms of lots of people travelling in, lots of people travelling out, and sort of maybe some we've seen some of that pattern shift a little bit as things have gone on. It'll be interesting to see how cost of living plays in locally, and how that continues to affect that trend, whether it further depresses local audiences, or not so much. But yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about all that whole travel picture earlier on, so I won't labour the point. We've got this strange picture in terms of COVID and cost of living sort of clashing against itself. The sales were starting to get sort of around about backish, late spring, early summer, but overall, on average, they're still, that sort of 27% down, despite the fact that there is, some segments, and particularly this one that's big in the population, that we've said there's a potential around private creativity, doing relatively well. But of course, they're right in the front line in terms of cost of living. So again, we might see that picture shifting as we get later on. So yes, that's going to be one of the big questions over the next 12 months, is how to sort of keep engagement from those that have come back, but also bring back the ones who maybe haven't come back so far, but are maybe feeling more able to, given their relative situation. So metroculturals still stand out, but maybe drops back a little bit in the mix. And some of those family groups, we have this kind of, I guess, a year and a half with relatively boosted family audiences. And we know, and we've seen long-term trends, that there's lots of potential for family engagement, and things like the family arts campaign, the Albany sort of a key supporter of, as being a real opportunity for the sector as a whole. And I think in the long term that's still true, and it's still sort of, if you like, the direction of travel. But we do have families being particularly hit by this pinch point. And so where we saw a really positive picture from families coming off the back of the pandemic compared to other groups, much earlier to return, keener to return, returning in higher frequencies, that is now likely to be pushed a bit. So that's another thing to keep an eye on.